When the euro crisis started in Greece in spring 2010 and the Greek government asked for financial assistance, the IMF staff in Greece said such emergency loans would make no sense without a prior debt relief. Why did the euro governments and the IMF not follow these recommendations?
The IMF staff were overruled by the managing director of the IMF, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who had ambitions to be French president and didn't want to impose losses on French banks. And at the same time, German banks furiously lobbied Angela Merkel that it would be deeply damaging to impose losses on them. As a result of that, the Eurozone governments decided to pretend that Greece was merely going through temporary funding difficulties and to bypass the legal basis on which the euro was founded, the no bailout rule, and lend money to Greece, not in order to bail out the Greek government, but in order to bail out the French and German banks that had recklessly lent to an insolvent Greek government.
Do you know the volume, how much money was involved from the German and French bank side?
Well, at the end of March 2010, foreign banks owned 69 billion euros worth of Greek government bonds, of which French banks owned 20 billion euros worth and German banks 17 billion euros worth.
In the IMF board, I was told the Europeans argued a debt restructuring for Greece could trigger a domino effect so that many other euro countries could be cut off from the capital market as well. Weren't they right?
The argument that Eurozone governments made to justify this bailout of French and German banks was that it would cause panic, a Lehman-style panic. But there is a world of difference between the chaotic collapse of a complex global investment bank and the orderly restructuring of the debt of a small country in southeastern Europe. Crucially, though, the decision to bail out Greece did not prevent panic. On the contrary, it created over the next 2 years the panic that almost destroyed the Eurozone.
You wrote in your book, in October 2010, you said to the then president of the EU Commission, Barroso, that there was no way to avoid a write-off of Greek sovereign debt. What was his answer?
I'm not allowed to reveal private discussions, so
okay.
I'm sorry. I can say what I said to him, but no, I have a legal contract. I'm not allowed to reveal the contents of private conversations.
Well, but it's my duty to ask.
Sure, but no, I mean, they hate me enough as it is. I don't want them. I don't want them suing me as well.
When the decision was taken to grant emergency loans to Greece, this came under conditions. The draconian cuts in expenditures and tax increases of up to 18% of the GDP in only 3 years. For Greece, this was an economic catastrophe. Was this an accident, or has it been done on purpose?
Well, clearly, Greece would have suffered much less had its debts been written down in 2010. Because of that fateful mistake to lend German taxpayers' money to the Greek government, Angela Merkel was desperate to try and get her money back as quickly as possible. And as a result, a truly brutal program of austerity was imposed that has caused a longer and deeper slump than Germany suffered during the Great Depression. And the irony of all this is that this caused so much economic damage that actually the losses to German taxpayers are going to be greater as a result of this very harsh austerity. Now, why was this very harsh austerity imposed in this way? As I said, the primary reason was the desire to get the money back. It was also based on a misunderstanding of economics and a belief that somehow austerity would be expansionary. If you look at the original EU IMF program, the belief was that this would provoke an investment boom, which of course never happened.
When it turned out that the spending cuts and the tax increases made it all worse, as you said now, why did the Euro governments not change the course?
Well, I mean, they were committed to the policy, so they didn't want to lose face. And above all, the priority in all this was to try and get, once you've realized the mistake, to try and get back as much money as possible and minimize your losses. And to this day, as I know from personal experience, many people in Brussels, and indeed many people in the German government, do not think that they made a mistake. They think that austerity was the right course of action. They see it, in the German case, almost in moral terms. Greeks have sinned during the boom years, and now they must repent, and repentance involves suffering in order to attain redemption. And its economics scarcely comes into it.
And you think only because of this, in order not to lose face, or because of moral considerations, the whole Greek people are sacrificed to an economic catastrophe?
Well, I think that's the horror of all this. The European project is meant to be based on solidarity, and instead the desire of the Greeks to be part of Europe, their fear of being forced out of the euro, has been abused to impose on them the most unjust conditions and the most terrible suffering, and that is outrageous.
Mm-hmm. The German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble explains the root of the crisis in the eurozone with the words, "Governments' public debts and deficits are too high because their public sectors spend too much. That is why immediate fiscal consolidations is of essence." For many Germans, this sounds very plausible. Isn't he right?
It's absolutely not true. If you look in the pre-crisis years, both Spain and Ireland ran budget surpluses. They had extremely low levels of public debt, I think 25% or so in the case of Ireland, 36% or so in the case of Spain. So that simply isn't true. Even in cases where big budget deficits and rising debts existed in 2010, embarking on austerity at a time when the private sector, households and companies are desperately trying to save more, at a time when banks are bust and therefore not lending, is actually counterproductive. So even if you accept that false analysis, it doesn't mean that austerity was the right policy to pursue collectively across Europe in 2010 and has caused huge unnecessary suffering. According to a study by a European Commission official using the European Commission's own economic model, the cumulative loss to the Eurozone economy of this collective excessive austerity is nearly 10% of Eurozone GDP, and nobody has been held to account.
But why then the Euro governments did, in spite of all the available evidence that austerity would make things only worse, why did they insist to go on?
There are always academics, either for ideological reasons or for reasons of personal ambition, who are willing to tell people in power what they want to hear. And there was an Italian economist called Alberto Alesina who made a presentation to Eurozone finance ministers in early 2010, where he made the argument that austerity was going to be expansionary. And as a result of that, Jean-Claude Trichet, the president of the European Central Bank, and indeed other Eurozone finance ministers, began to talk in public and act as if this was true. There was also another piece of research which was subsequently debunked, which was by Reinhardt and Rogoff, which allegedly showed that once debt reached 90% of GDP, that growth ground to a halt. And Olli Rehn, the EU Economics Commissioner, and others said, well, we need to have fiscal consolidation now because we're just about 90%, and if we don't, we're going to have a recession. The fact is that, first of all, that piece of research was wrong, and second of all, embarking on collective austerity caused a much, much greater recession than even that piece of research predicted.
Well, but that would mean they were only misled by bad economists and ideology.
No, I said the bad economists. Well, it was a political choice. It was a political choice. It was a political choice born in part of ideology, but also the self-interest of Germany as a creditor. Once Angela Merkel has made the mistake of putting German taxpayers on the hook for Southern Europe's debts in order to covertly bail out German banks, once she's made that mistake, then she has a selfish interest as a creditor to impose as harsh terms as possible.
But was the apparent necessity to save only, was it not in many cases also an excuse to impose a hidden agenda, a second agenda?
That's why I said there is an ideological agenda too. There's an ideological agenda of many people who have been wanting to cut back public spending for many years, and who seized on this as an opportunity to achieve that objective. You look, for example, at the speeches of Jean-Claude Trichet, and he'd been calling for austerity for a long time, and he seized on the opportunity, which is quite inappropriate for an independent central banker whose remit does not stretch to fiscal policy. It certainly served the interest of the European Commission, because the European Commission wanted more powers for itself, and as a result of the crisis gained new powers first as part of the Troika, but also over Eurozone government as a whole through the enhanced fiscal controls that exist in the reformed Stability and Growth Pact. And at the time, remember, it's not just Angela Merkel, but most leading governments were conservative, with politicians who were either suspicious or completely opposed to Keynesian policies, and therefore didn't see that cutting back the state had any economic cost. On the other hand, on the contrary, it served a political objective.
Mm-hmm. And you've worked with all these Commission officials. Have there ever been internal debates about maybe our course is wrong, or the results are bad, we should change, or something like that? You know, it's difficult to imagine that on the one hand people in Greece and Portugal suffer very hard, or even also in Ireland, and that on the other hand then they're in Brussels, there are officials who do not care.
Well, absolutely, that's the problem. I mean, I'm profoundly pro-European. At the same time, it is clear that having unelected, unaccountable, and very often incompetent officials in Brussels taking decisions about people from which they are detached and to whom they are not accountable doesn't work. So, you know, if you're Angela Merkel, you take policy decisions which impose suffering on, you know, Greek people or Portuguese people, and ultimately you're only accountable to German voters. And if you're working for the European Commission, you have a job for life and you're accountable to your boss, but certainly not for any suffering you might cause. So, for example, you do a program for Greece. The program predicts that unemployment's going to rise to 15%. You know, it turns out to be 25%. Oh, you've just changed the number in the spreadsheet, and the human suffering really doesn't come into it.
While Europe turned to austerity, the Americans did the opposite. Or at least they did not save while the private sectors were saving. Have you talked to American colleagues what they think about what the Europeans are doing?
Throughout the crisis, I spoke a lot to officials at the US Treasury who, like me, were despairing and often not understanding the course of action that European governments were pursuing. You know, when we are told now, oh look, we have a recovery, actually we hardly have a recovery at all. But when we're told now we have a recovery, it's a sign of the success of our policies. Remember that the United States had a deeper financial crisis than Europe did, and yet since 2010 the US economy has been growing. In fact, its economy is now 7% larger than in 2008, which is much better than even Germany, which is up about 3%. It's much better than the Eurozone as a whole, which is about flat, and it's certainly much better than Southern Europe, which where the economies have collapsed. So,
but America's debt is higher than the one of the Eurozone.
You know, it depends which country you're looking at. In any case, the United States, while its management of the crisis has clearly not been perfect, has restored growth quicker, restored bank lending to the economy faster, successfully boosted investment, has unemployment down to below the levels in 2008, and done a much better job generally. Crucially, the level of private sector debt in the United States has fallen substantially, and in the Eurozone it has scarcely begun, which means that this period of stagnation that we're in now is likely to endure for perhaps a decade, as the past few years have been wasted in the pursuit of austerity instead of government spending, giving the private sector, the households and companies, the space and the scope to reduce their debts.
But doesn't the US government now have a huge problem with very high sovereign debt? Above 110% of GDP?
That's not.
At least above 100.
That's not the figure that I need to check it up. That's not the figure that. Well, The first thing is the United States can borrow at extremely low interest rates. Its government deficit has fallen substantially, partly as a result of fiscal measures taken last year, but mainly because of the recovery. In any case, its economy has performed much better as a result of, as I said, not a perfect policy mix, but a much better one than the Eurozone. I mean, someone needs to be held to account for the fact that 10% of Eurozone GDP has been thrown away unnecessarily by the collective pursuit of excessive austerity. And the people who have suffered from this is not just Southern Europe. I mean, Germans have suffered too. Germans have suffered too because the austerity has depressed growth directly in Germany, and it depressed German exports to Southern Europe. So Germany too has suffered as a result of this, and it's going to suffer in the long term because the debts in Southern Europe are unpayable, and the losses that, or the exposure that Chancellor Merkel has taken on by lending to these countries is ultimately, some of that is going to be borne by German taxpayers.
You said somebody has to be held account. Who is someone? Who is somebody?
Well, I mean, in my experience, the crisis effort, the crisis response has been driven by Berlin and implemented by Brussels primarily. So that's where accountability lies.
Mm-hmm. When the rescue programs or the conditions for emergency loans were designed, how did the officials decide the priorities? What needs to be done first, and what second, and what third? I do ask because when we looked in the affected countries, usually the measures taken at first were those who hit workers, ordinary taxpayers, pensioners. All the other things came later, or not at all. So what was the driving force behind these programs, these conditions?
Well, the overriding priority has been austerity. If you listen to what politicians say, they say that the priority is reform, but the overriding priority has been austerity. So you see, for example, in Greece, that there has been a hell of a lot of austerity and hardly any reform. The fastest way, obviously, to close a budget deficit is to raise taxes, and so that has been the first priority. Let's be clear here. I mean, the Greek government is dysfunctional in the sense that it's not like government in Northern Europe where everyone more or less pays tax and efficient public services are delivered as a result. It is more like a client-based system where only some people pay tax, and that money is used to provide patronage for people who are either supporters of one political party or another. Let's not. The system that exists there is clearly not ideal, but neither is the imposition of tax rises and budget cuts by foreign creditors who don't have the best interests of the Greek people at heart, but rather are trying to get their money back.
Well, but why the programs are so biased? Yeah, usually capital owners in Greece, the oligarchs, the main families who own more than 50% of GDP, they are not touched. And even if they are mentioned in the Memorandum of Understanding, those measures are usually not implemented. For example, in Portugal, the Commission realized that all the so-called public-private partnerships were a bad deal for Portugal, and the memorandum demanded that these contracts needed to be renegotiated to make it better for the Portuguese taxpayers. But in 3 years, this has never happened. So my question is, how it came that the missions, the officials who were sent to the countries, why they didn't take care to make it more just and more balanced program. It was even mentioned by the IMF in its evaluation report that this was a mistake.
Sure.
But it never happened. What kind of force is there in way? They are only
well,
officials.
As I said, I think the key aim was the headline targets and trying to meet those, and much less attention was paid to how they were attained, and clearly that leaves some discretion in the hands of national governments, who in turn make decisions based on the political economy of that country. So you'll see that Mr. Samaras's government will try and minimize harm to people who support his government, and very often they are, as you say, the very rich families who control large parts of Greece, and likewise the government in Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, I take your point. At the same time, if you agree with me that we shouldn't have foreign officials running countries in a kind of quasi-imperialistic way, ultimately the responsibility for reforming their governments and ensuring justice should lie with those governments and with the people who elect those governments, rather than being imposed from outside.
Yes, but in practice, those officials sent to there, they intervene directly in government's work. For example, we've interviewed a former minister who told us how it was to be called around midnight and asked, or not asked, but forced to sign this and this document, otherwise the next tranche of the credit won't be transmitted. And he said how he felt blackmailed. And I wonder how it was possible to give a regime of unelected officials the power to blackmail member governments. Has it ever been considered in the inner circles that this might be a power abuse?
Clearly it is an abuse of power. The Troika was created on an ad hoc basis. It is completely inappropriate that it involves the unelected ECB. It is likewise inappropriate that it involves the European Commission, which has no competence or expertise in these matters. And the fact that it operates in secrecy with scarcely any accountability to democratic authorities ought not to be acceptable in modern Europe. In effect, they have acted like colonial masters.
One decisive moment of the whole development was in December 11, when the Greek Prime Minister Papandreou wanted the Troika program to be decided by the voters in a referendum. But this never happened, and instead Papandreou resigned. How this has been engineered? Have you followed it in detail?
Well, what happened, and it is pretty clear that Papandreou was in effect forced out of office by Eurozone authorities, as indeed was Silvio Berlusconi, and not my favourite politician, but still the elected Prime Minister of Italy. And in the case of Papandreou, this was achieved by threatening to force Greece out of the euro. And at that point, Samaras, who had previously been opposed to the EU IMF programme, saw this as a means of obtaining power and changed his views, and as a result ended up Prime Minister the year after. The key issue for me is that the European Central Bank, which is meant to be the central bank of all citizens who use the euro, threatened to deprive some of those citizens of the right to use their own currency in order to obtain a political objective, which was the implementation of an unjust Troika program in Greece. And that is clearly a gross abuse of power. Now, where there was a similar abuse of power in Ireland, Jean-Claude Trichet has refused to testify to an inquiry into those events. And I think that just epitomises the way that the ECB can get away with gross abuses of power by claiming that it is independent. But in a democracy, central bankers do not have a right to behave in that way.
What exactly happened in Ireland? You said in Ireland...
Oh, what happened in Ireland is a rather similar thing, in that the ECB threatened to cut off liquidity to Irish banks,
which would have meant that the banking system would collapse.
In effect, threatened to force Ireland out of the euro in order to force the Irish government to stick with a misguided guarantee of all Irish bank debt, the result of which is that Irish taxpayers face a 64 billion euro debt, which is 14,000 euro for every Irish person. Again, a gross abuse of power. Now, it's one thing to say that central banks are independent in their pursuit of monetary policy. It's quite another to say that they can act in a nakedly political manner, that they can, imagine if they threatened to deprive German people of the right to use the euro, or French people of the right to use the euro. It's a gross abuse of power.
Well, probably with Germany or France, they wouldn't even try.
Absolutely.
Because
but that's what
they knew that the next day the statute of the ECB would be changed.
Well, in effect, the ECB, which is meant to be the central bank of all citizens who use the euro, has acted in the interests of French and German banks and the French and German governments which bailed out those banks.
Today, those responsible claim that in spite of all the contradictions you named, after all, their rescue programs were a success because the recession in the crisis countries has stopped and unemployment has started to decrease. Are they right?
As a result of the mistaken programs, the recessions have been unnecessarily long and deep. Insofar as there is a recovery, it is the flimsiest, the weakest recovery on record. Greece's economy is still shrinking. In the latest quarter, Portugal's relapsed, and because of the fall of inflation, nominal GDP is basically stagnant. Unemployment is extremely high, and on current trends is not going to fall back to normal levels for 10 or 15 years. And crucially, the levels of public debt and private debt remain extremely high. So to call this a success, I think is setting the bar extremely low.
What can be done to improve the dire situation? Or because it's still very fragile, no? It could happen that we fall in deflation and we'll have Japanese-like stagnation for a decade or so. So what needs to be done?
Well, my baseline scenario is that we are going to have a Japanese-style stagnation, and that there is a very real threat that Southern Europe is going to sink into a deflationary debt trap. What needs to be done is what I advised President Barroso at our first meeting in 2010, which is restructure banks fairly and decisively, write down excessive debts, both public and private, boost investment, and implement reforms to open up healthier future forms of growth. And unless we do those four things, the short term is stagnation, and in the medium term there will be bankruptcies and defaults. And the political consequences of this, I think, will be dire. I mean, we can see already what happened in the European elections, where there was a collapse in support for mainstream parties, a large rise in support for the far right, a general disillusionment and disenchantment with the European Union, and ultimately a threat to our open societies.
But the 4 points you mentioned would mean, in the first 2 points, that a lot of investors and bank owners and holders of debt of all kinds would lose a lot of money. And the other 2 points mean that the whole concept, now designed with the Fiscal Compact and all the laws governing how the fiscal operations managed by the governments had to be done. All this is a straitjacket which makes it nearly impossible to do or to fulfill these 4 demands you've set. How to overcome this deadlock?
Well, I mean, I think it is right and proper that creditors pay the price for their mistakes. The crisis was caused primarily by the reckless lending of German and French banks, together with local banks in the affected countries. And it is right and proper that if you lend too much badly to people who end up insolvent, that you suffer losses for that. It's not only right and proper, it's necessary for the recovery. Because the longer that we have banks that won't lend to viable businesses and economies that are depressed by excessive layers of debt, the longer that we have economic stagnation, which is not just imposing huge suffering and extinguishing hope in Southern Europe, but also is not in the interests of Northern Europe. If Germany wants to be surrounded by successful, happy economies, if it wants to have a viable export market, then it too has an interest in encouraging recovery in Southern Europe.
Well, but look, for example, what's happening with the Greek banks. I've dealt intensively with Greek banks, and they have spent nearly 40 billion euros, borrowed money from the other Euro countries to recapitalize their banks. And still the non-performing loans are growing. And what is happening now is that these, in practice, nationalized banks are being sold at bargain prices to American hedge fund investors. So this is more or less the opposite of what you said, what needs to be done. Yeah? Only by selling them to American and Canadian funds, they say, no, look, the market again is interested in investing in Greece. Do you know how this contradictions and ridiculous development came? Why this Greek program, for example?
Well, listen, I think the big picture underlying all this is, one, the capture of all governments by their banks, and two, as a result of the crisis, the capture of EU and Eurozone institutions by Germany to serve its narrow interests as a creditor. In effect, then, the whole of the Eurozone is being run for the interests of French and German banks. And that is just simply not sustainable, it's not right, and it's not sustainable. So, of course, breaking those links and imposing losses on powerful entities is not easy, but ultimately, if it isn't done in an orderly way, ultimately people will not accept and will rebel against that. And I think that's only a matter of time.
And the second part of your program, meaning to increase public investment, isn't it forbidden more or less now with the fiscal compact and the binding rules for the deficit reduction?
I agree with you. I mean, I think that the much tighter rules in the Stability and Growth Pact and the Fiscal Compact, which is now in national constitutions, locks in semi-permanent austerity, does not give countries the requisite flexibility, and doesn't distinguish between investment that creates future growth and future tax revenues and consumption which doesn't. So yes, those rules are completely misconceived, and at the very least they need to be loosened. Better still, they ought to be scrapped.
You've even dubbed it fiscal colonialism. What is this?
Well, as I say, if you see what's happened, not just in the Troika countries, but across the Eurozone, in almost every election since the crisis, voters have rejected the government and rejected the failed policies of the government. And as soon as they elect a new one, EU Economics Commissioner Olli Rehn pops up on television saying, you must stick to the failed policies of the government you have just rejected. Now, if you're a voter in such a country, you go, well, what's the point of voting? I vote to get rid of a government and end up with the same policies I've just rejected. So what does that do? First of all, it turns people against the European Union, because if the European Union stands for austerity and recession, then I must be against it. And second of all, it forces people to vote for extremists, because voting for mainstream parties doesn't deliver change. So this is deeply undesirable in the short term, and ultimately, I think, unsustainable.
And colonialism?
Well, but as I said, in effect, as a result of the crisis, the political economy of this is that Germany is imposing controls on others, but not on itself. So Germany wants much tighter controls over other countries' budgets, and that has been achieved through the Fiscal Compact and through the tighter rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. It doesn't want controls over its banks, and therefore the banking union is bogus. So you see, in effect, that through its control of EU institutions, that Germany is running Southern Europe almost as if they were colonies.
What do you expect how the European Union will develop over the next 10 years?
Well, I think we need a European spring. We need a European spring of economic and political renewal. We need to deal with the crisis fairly and decisively, and we need to create a Eurozone that works for all its citizens. And we need to create a much more democratic European Union where all Europeans have a much greater say over the direction it takes and the decisions it takes. At the moment, what we have is extremely political decisions which benefit banks in some countries at the expense of everyone else, being taken as if they were neutral technocratic decisions for which political accountability is not necessary. And that clearly is wrong.
What you said, what is needed, is contrary to all what is on the agenda right now. So my question was, what do you expect realistically? What do you expect is going to happen in the next 10 years?
Well, I think Europe needs to change.
Well, and if it does not?
Well, there are all sorts of, as I said before, I think what you've seen since the crisis is a collapse in support for the European Union. The European Union used to be associated with peace and prosperity. It's now associated with austerity, with recession, and with German domination. And you've seen that nationalism and xenophobia are on the march in Europe again, and that is deeply worrying. So a wise statesman will recognize that and say, we need to preempt a much greater crisis. If political leaders are not wise enough to do that, and if other forces are not strong enough to force them to, then I think the consequences can be very severe.
And what?
I think it's a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy. As I said, my book is extremely critical of the decisions that have been taken, but from a pro-European perspective, I want Europe to work, and I want the Eurozone to work, and it is a tragedy that a series of policy mistakes have been made that are destroying Europe and destroying the Eurozone.
We have very much to lose. No? For me, I'm the European generation. Yeah? When I compare how Europe was in the 60s when I was a child to today, there are so many things we have gained, and many people do not realize what's on stake. Huh? Why they have no feeling. Yeah? When I talk to my fellow Germans and discuss with them about Europe, they are all negative now. There's a negative majority, even in Germany.
Sure.
But do the people that you've been close to, do they just not care, or what is their attitude? I mean, they must see that
that their own institution is in
that
danger.
they own run it down and run it into tragedy.
Well, I think first of all, people have short time horizons, and they want to, if you're a politician, you want to win the next election, or you just want to get through the next week. And if you are working for a European institution in Brussels, you're actually completely detached from politics. You're insulated from it. You have a job for life. You tend to only talk to people who work for EU institutions or who want money from the EU institutions or a real change in the EU institutions. And so what's happening in these countries is far away and misunderstood. So it's a bit like, Marie Antoinette in her palace going, let them eat cake. Complete lack of understanding and connection with the suffering of ordinary people. And that's very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. You said what's desperately needed is more investment, of course. How we can achieve this? How we can achieve more investment, private or public, whatever?
Well, I think the need for increased investment is true across Europe. One way to do that would be to increase the capital of the European Investment Bank to fund a new wave of investments. You could set up a specific investment fund for that purpose. Remember that at the moment governments can borrow at record low levels, and therefore the cost of this investment is low, and the benefits at a time of depressed economies are particularly large, not just in terms of boosting spending now, but in terms of boosting future growth too. Now, Germany ought to play its part. If you see investment in Germany has collapsed since 2000. In the latest budget plans that Angela Merkel is putting forward, there are further cuts to investment, and you can see all around you that Germany is suffering as a result. German infrastructure is falling apart. The Kiel Canal had to be closed. In terms of the global education rankings, Germany is sinking. So it's in Germany's interest too to invest.
There are some economists, Janusz Varoufakis, James Galbraith and others, who have come up with a so-called modest proposal. And one core element in this proposal is this investment fund run by the European Investment Bank, funded by bonds to be bought by the European Central Bank. Is this a sensible proposal?
Well, I think that it's unlikely that the ECB is going to embark on quantitative easing anytime soon, but it has signalled that if it does, it is reluctant to buy the bonds of national governments. So an alternative to that might be to buy the bonds of a European investment fund, which clearly operates at a European level and which might involve less of the so-called moral hazard problems about which the ECB is worried. So yes, I think that could be a possibility.
Okay, thank you very much.